Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum. We want to welcome our friends in South Africa, the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. I'm pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. Today's topic will center around a newly released book and a first-time guest. Special guests who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a number of years. Brother SHAKIR Bakari Williams, before we get into the conversation, I want to mention a little something about the book itself. The book is entitled The Enemy Within: Why We Black Americans Must Confront Ourselves. A good starting point for today's conversation is the book's summary. It reads as follows: this book is an internal critique and analysis of the various ways in which Black Americans, both historically and contemporarily, have pursued certain behaviors, ideologies, and cultural practices that have been self-destructive and counterproductive to the improvement and betterment of the Black American community. As we Black Americans still contend with outside forces, such as systemic racism, that continues to present obstacles toward our advancement as a people, we make our situation worse in America because of our jealousy, envy, and group self-hatred, along with certain pathologies that serve to sabotage our own growth and development from within. Additionally, it is now known that other Black Americans played major roles in the demise of some of America's most famous Black American civil and human rights leaders and personalities. There are many reasons for this, of which I describe in the ensuing chapters throughout the book. Now, with that as an introduction, let's welcome our guests to today's conversation. Assalamu alaikum, Brother SHAKIR Bakari Williams.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome aboard, my brother.
Thank you so much, brother, for having me.
Alhamdulillah, it's my pleasure. Let's begin with some background on yourself, Aki. Where you were born, where you grew up, and anything else you deem to be pertinent.
Sure. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan in 1966. My mother, Alice Jean Williams, was born in Gaston, Alabama, and then relocated to Detroit, Michigan in around 1929. My father, Alfred Williams, was born in Detroit. And my mom has a very interesting history. My mom, when she was a little girl, she met George Washington Carver. He came to her elementary school. She met James Weldon Johnson, the author of the now famous song, Lift Every Voice and Sing, that is generally recognized as the national anthem for Black America. She knew a whole plethora of celebrities and civil rights and activists. She and my father marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he came to Detroit, Michigan on January 5th of 1963, wherein he made the first I Have a Dream speech. That speech was made in Detroit. And so my parents, both of them, in fact, my father, I mentioned this in the book, My father was a Korean vet, and he was one of a few Americans to have gone to Dien Bien Phu after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954 by the Vietnamese forces of Ho Chi Minh. My father was one of a few Americans to go to the battle site after the battle. And so the role that they played in history shaped me and helped to shape my love of history. And there were a whole host of other forces in Detroit that were happening when I came into the world when I was a little boy. You know, a lot of the movements which I talk about, a lot of the personalities. So those confluence of factors helped to shape me and help shape my love of history.
Hmm. Now, despite the limited amount of time we have for today's conversation, the table of contents for your book, The Enemy Within: Why We Black Americans Must Confront Ourselves, is worthy of a little exploration. Now, after the acknowledgments and the foreword and the introduction, the chapter titles are as follows. Chapter 1: How did we Black Americans become a despised and oppressed group? Chapter 2: How did Black Americans learn to devalue and hate each other? Chapter 3: How integration underdeveloped Black America. Chapter 4: Black America's historical betrayal of its leaders, heroes, and heroines. Chapter 5: The psychology of religious expression in the Black American community. And Chapter 6: The Black American family dynamic: cohesion, community, or chaos. Now, under these major chapter titles, there are subchapters, and now each one of these subchapters is a provocative read in and of itself. Question: Is there a chapter or two that stands out most for you, and if so, why?
I would probably say the chapter that stands out for me would be Black America's historical betrayal of its leaders, heroes, and heroines. And I would say that because there's information that I found that was frightening, that was earth-shattering, that I never knew. I mean, some of the other chapters, some of the other themes of the chapters, I had some understanding. I had some understanding of the Moynihan Report and some of the ominous warnings that Daniel Patrick Moynihan made in 1965 regarding the rise of female-headed households in the Black family, in the Black community. I had some understanding of that. Obviously, I did more research and found some more specifics. But the chapter that stands out to me would be chapter 4, because of the deep, deep levels of betrayal that occurred with some of these now famous assassinations and murders of civil rights activists throughout the United States.
Yeah, please expound, brother, a bit more on that
Sure.
chapter and your thoughts on the issues raised.
Yeah, sure. So many of these slave revolts that took place, I mentioned 3, 2 of which were aborted. They never made it out of their infancy. The slave revolt of Gabriel Prosser, or the aborted slave revolt of Gabriel Prosser, and the aborted slave revolt of Denmark Vesey. In both instances, these were betrayed by other slaves. Nat Turner, Nat Turner himself was betrayed by other slaves. Harriet Tubman, and this is one of the facts that I didn't know. So I'll just go down the list of names and I'll pick one given what has happened recently. So Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, James Chaney, Michael Swerner, Andrew Goodman, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Every individual that I mentioned was in some way, shape, or form betrayed by other African Americans, by other Black Americans. I'll mention one, Emmett Till. Many people are familiar with the murder of Emmett Till. Many people view Emmett Till's murder as the watershed event that gave rise to the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And it's ironic that the major protagonists in that horrific episode, Carolyn Bryant Dunham, she just passed away a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. And she was the woman who accused Emmett Till of making a sexual pass at her and whistling at her and saying allegedly he said bye baby to her, which she later recanted these accusations and labeled them as false. But what I didn't know, and I'm sure what many people didn't know also, is that Black American, African American men played an active role in the kidnapping, torture, and murder of Emmett Till.
Yes, indeed. And that is a disturbing revelation, just to say the least. I was out of town at the time that I saw the video. I was out of town at the time that you had your book launch, but I did see the video. It was a very impressive program. It was a very impressive book launch that you had. The presentation was thought-provoking that you did. I recall you saying that one or more overseas experiences also factored into your decision to write this book. Now, what were these overseas experiences, brother, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, sure. Well, the Hajj was one. Mm-hmm. And I made Hajj in 2012, alhamdulillah, and I made Umrah the year before in 2011. And just my travel, the Hajj in terms of this, not only the unity of humanity, but also the unity and the natural way in which various tribes and ethnic groups from the Ummah acknowledge and recognize their own unique identity, but they recognize themselves as part of the Ummah as well. But they still retain their own individual identity. Mm-hmm. And obviously we're familiar with the well-known verse in the Quran in Surah Al-Hujurat, where Allah says, in the second part of the verse, وَجَعَلْنَكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا, that we made you into, they say nations and tribes or ethnic groups and subgroups, لِتَعَارَفُوا, in order that you may mutually recognize and know each other. One of the things that I wrote in the book is that I wanted to address this issue amongst indigenous African American or Black American Muslims, where we left our community, just to speak plainly and straight to the truth, because of certain misunderstandings that we have promoted over the decades that I've been Muslim. So that was one issue that I wanted to address that stuck out at me.
Mhm.
The other thing that made me write the book was that in my international travels, I was amazed at which African Americans, Black Americans had influenced the world. So I'll give you a couple examples. When I was on Hajj, so I'm on the bus in Jeddah with the other Hujjaj, and we're on the bus, we're leaving Jeddah on our way to Mecca. And I'm looking out of the bus in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and I see a building, the side of a building that has the name Tupac Shakur and an image of Tupac Shakur in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia.
Mhm.
And I say, wow. I say, that stuck out at me.
Mhm.
The other thing that stuck out at me, so I was fortunate in 2012, in December of 2012, I made the first of two trips to Southeast Asia. And one of the trips was to Indonesia. So I went to Jakarta and I took the train, 2-hour train ride from Jakarta, Indonesia to Bandung, Indonesia, because I wanted to go to the Bandung Conference Museum. And because, when I was younger, Malcolm X, Rahimahullah, El-Hajj Malik Shabazz gave the now famous A Message to a Grassroots speech in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, where he referenced the Bandung Conference.
Yes, he did. Yes.
And so I wanted to go to this conference. For those who don't know, the Bandung Conference was held in 1955, and it was a program designed to attract representatives of the non-European world to address the problem of colonialism, imperialism, racism, and one of the top agendas at the Bandung Conference was apartheid.
Mhm.
And Europeans were not allowed to come to the conference. And there were 3 African Americans who attended the conference. Ethel Payne, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, and writer, black boy, Richard Wright. Richard Wright was sitting with his wife, and he read about the upcoming Bandung Conference. And he said, "You mean to tell me all of these millions of representatives of African Arab countries meeting?" So Richard Wright went there as an independent journalist, and he wrote a book called The Color Curtain about his recollections of the Bandung Conference. When I went to the Bandung Conference Museum, they had his book in the glass showcase inside of the museum.
Yeah.
Now, I've been to 2 historically Black American, African American colleges and universities. I never ever knew this book existed, brother Mauri.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact to actually go over there and see it in a glass showcase, and the degree of reverence and respect that they had for his contribution to the conference and the ideas that could emanate from the conference. That was the other reason that led me to say I needed to write and talk about our influence around the world and how people view our contributions and value us more than we unfortunately value ourselves.
Mhm. Now, brother, you have been a teacher and you have also worked within the criminal justice system. How has that factored into your thought process and into the the substance of what went into this book?
Yeah, I worked in the criminal justice system in Detroit, Michigan, as a probation officer, and one of the things that I noticed immediately was the correlation. A couple of things: the correlation between illiteracy and criminal behavior, and the fact that uh, criminal behavior had been legitimized. And the irony that the music and some of the cultural expressions now legitimize going to prison and becoming incarcerated as like a badge of honor.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony that prison, when I was reading books and when I became, when I was a student at Howard and Central State, when I was reading books, when I was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and I was reading about, Soledad Brothers and learning about the Attica prison riot, prison was a place of thought develop of rehabilitation, transformation, and the emergence of revolutionary ideas, and seeing prison as an extension of the oppressive arm that has been used to against people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. And so the fact that people in our community now have normalized being in prison and being associated with the criminal justice system was very disturbing. And that factored in to it as well. Similar thoughts revolve around education and the fact that the irony that when we as African Americans, when we as Black Americans, when we were forced to go to segregated schools, when we were forced to go to schools that were often run down and the books were secondhand, we excelled academically. We excelled academically. And the irony now that in many of the urban centers that you go to now, we have normalized this idea of accepting, mediocrity and not being as adamant about learning and developing ourselves as we were in instances where the racism was more visceral.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that point you just made, it deserves, it is worthy of even more attention, more perspective, more of your perspective as someone who has operated within the system, someone who has a very clear view and a respectful view of history. That what you just said, it deserves a bit more exploration, especially as it pertains to the impact that desegregation, that integration has had on the African American community. It is not. It has not all been good. In fact, much of it has been a detriment to the kind of values, the kind of work hard and study hard and pull yourself up kind of tradition that many of our people were known for.
That's right. So the NAACP and the other organizations who led the push toward desegregation, it started out as a grievance against unfair funding or lack of funding for African American segregated schools under state governments.
Right.
And so they said
which was a legitimate complaint.
Which was a legitimate complaint. Mm-hmm. The problem was that legitimate complaint and Thurgood Marshall changed course during the court proceedings. Mm-hmm. And so what started out as a legitimate complaint for underfunding now became a crusade toward integration. Mm-hmm. And the problem was that in many instances, Black Americans threw away things that were already working. Correct. The issue of funding for segregated schools, the fact that legal obstacles to our being able to avail ourselves as a modern society, of the broader society, those needed to be erased. But does that now mean that we give up our own institutions, our own businesses, our
Right.
own schools,
Right.
although they need funding, but they don't need to be closed down so that we can be bused into someone else's district?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to give up our own businesses and our own institutions for that to happen. And so, and the other point I wanted to make along with this is this dichotomy, this historical dichotomy between integration and separation. And there was a third element, pluralism.
Mm-hmm.
The third element, which I argue, is that we should have pursued a pluralistic pursuit whereby we avail ourselves of what the broader society has to offer, but we maintain our own identity, our own institutions,
Mm-hmm.
and our own worldview and epistemologies.
Right.
This is the other destruction of integration, which I talk about in chapter 6. We have integrated the immorality, the decadence, the liberalism of other people into our community. We've normalized things in our community as a result of the influences of liberals from other groups. We've normalized things into our community that were never normalized before. And this has been very destructive.
Mm-hmm. And the impact of family.
Yes, yes. The irony that, so many people will say, make the argument that broken families in the Black American community and African American community goes back to slavery. First of all, this is not true. In the decades after slavery and on up to the 1960s, we had strong families. Now, they were not perfect. Obviously, there were the legacies of Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
There were the economic struggles of Black men. There was the unemployment, the periods of underemployment and so forth. But we still normalized male-female relations in terms of marriage. And so having a father in the home was seen as normal.
Mm-hmm.
But beginning in the 1960s, this started to change. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote his now controversial report entitled The Moynihan Report, The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was an Irish senator, his family originally moved from out west. His father had an advertising job in New York City, and they moved to New York City. And his father ultimately abandoned the family. And when Daniel Moynihan wrote about this growing phenomenon of female-headed households in the African American, Black American community, many people dismissed him as a white man who was speaking in a very paternalistic or condescending manner. But Daniel Patrick Moynihan's father left him and left the family. So Moynihan's analysis of this growing problem in the Black community was personalized because he had seen what his father not being there had done to him and what it had done to other Irish American families. But people dismissed his argument and they didn't give it the necessary attention that it should have received.
Mm-hmm.
And so then there was the importation of certain brands of feminism that legitimized female-headed households by encouraging Black women that, you know, they didn't need a man, they could do it themselves. Lyndon B. Johnson's programs said that African American women, if they wanted to continue to receive welfare from the federal government. They could not have a man in the home. So there was a rule called the no man in the house rule, which meant that a social worker could arbitrarily visit any home. And if a man was seen to be living at the home, the woman could lose her public assistance.
Yeah.
But it's also our willful acceptance of the practices of liberal white Americans, the whole countercultural sexual revolution that normalize sex outside of marriage, that normalize sex, relationships just purely based on sex, not realizing the effect that this would have on the children when these relations ultimately came apart, as many of them ultimately did, because relationships based on purely on sex can't last. So I talk about these factors in chapter 6.
Mm-hmm. Okay, brother, as I knew would be the case, I mean, we've already expended a half hour, and we've got some other business that we need to weigh in on before we leave. And I'm going to have you back, inshallah ta'ala, in the early part of next year. We're going to continue this conversation. We're going to explore other parts of your book, because it's, I can tell just from the table of contents and knowing you for the years that I've known you, brother, that this is a very important read. But for the sake of closing out this part of the broadcast, I want to get your thought on the crisis that has the attention of the, just about the entire global community right now. But before we do, there's a piece of video I want us to see. Brother Sadiq, show the piece of video of the medical doctor sharing his report on the conditions that he's come across in Gaza. Let's see that, please.
We are reaching the point of no return, where blatant disregard for international humanitarian law scars our collective consciousness. As of this morning, 283 healthcare workers in Gaza have been killed. The last 2 months has been the deadliest conflict in United Nations history, with 133 of their staff members killed. There have been 212 attacks on Gaza healthcare facilities since October 7th. This includes 24 different hospitals that have been bombed by Israel, over 100 ambulances that have been put out of service. Israel has arrested dozens of doctors. Their whereabouts remain unknown. The head of the main hospital, Shifa Hospital in Gaza City, Mohammed Abu Salmiya, has been under Israeli arrest since November 22nd. Many other senior doctors have continued to be held by the Israeli military for almost 2 weeks with no charges, and no one knows their whereabouts. Rantizi Pediatric Subspecialty Hospital, bombed. Al-Nasser Pediatric Hospital, bombed. Gaza's only eye hospital, bombed. Gaza's only mental health hospital, bombed. Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital, bombed. The seniors facility immediately adjacent to Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital, bombed. Al-Jura Children's Hospital, targeted with prohibited white phosphorus, October 12th. Indonesian Hospital, the only hospital currently operating in the north, still trying to treat patients while being bombed. Shifa Hospital, bombed. The two medical schools in Gaza, Islamic University of Gaza, bombed. Al-Azhar University Medical School, bombed. Médecins Sans Frontières ambulance convoy, bombed. Red Cross ambulance convoys, bombed. Of 35 hospitals in Gaza, as of this morning, 26 are non-functional, 9 remaining only partially functional, but they are operating at more than double their capacity, with critical shortages of basic supplies and fuel. These facilities are also providing shelter to thousands of internally displaced people. Palestine Red Crescent Society yesterday announced that operations of their ambulances in northern Gaza has stopped due to depletion of fuel, hospital closures. It is now impossible to evacuate wounded people in the north. Instead, those patients are left to die. As of this morning, over 17,000 Palestinian people have been killed, including over 7,000 children. There are at least 46,000 people injured, thousands of whom are critically injured. There is insufficient hospital space to treat even a fraction of these patients. Massively overcrowded United Nations shelters have become havens to spread infectious diseases, including a hepatitis A outbreak, multiple meningitis outbreaks, lice, skin infections, and multiple diarrheal illness outbreaks. The United Nations Human Rights Office has declared on December 5th the pattern of attacks that target civilian infrastructure raises serious concerns about Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law and raises the risk of atrocity crimes. There have been immeasurable numbers of violations of special protection to civilians, children, and medical personnel, and widespread violations of international humanitarian law.
Now, my brother, I've known you long enough and I know you well enough to opine that you feel much the same as I do as a conscious, pretty well-informed African-American male. And this goes for our African-American well-informed females as well. You feel a special affinity to what is happening to our Palestinian brothers and sisters, both on the West Bank and in Jerusalem, but also and particularly in Gaza, what Gaza is going through right now. I'd like for you to conclude this visit to our platform with your thoughts on what's happening right now in that tortured part of the world.
Well, first of all, we understand Zionism as the racist, settler, colonialist ideology that it is. And under this ideology, the Palestinians can never be human. In the same way that the indigenous Americans in this country were never considered humans by the English, by the racist settler colonialists from England. The Africans in South Africa could never be considered humans by the racist settler colonialists of the Afrikaners and the English there. And so when I look at these atrocities and these blatant violations of humanitarian law, which to my readings and understanding of World War II, I don't even think the Nazis deliberately bombed hospitals. I can't recall the Nazis deliberately targeting hospitals. And so, and the fact that they are given carte blanche access to do this by the United States government, again, given its own historical legacy of settler colonialism. So for me, it's just a reminder that our Palestinian brothers and sisters can never be given justice because they're not seen as human. And the evil and the wickedness that the Zionists have turned the narrative. The other thing I'd just like to point out very briefly, brother Saalakhan, before you move on, is it also exposes the impotence of the leaders in the Muslim world,
Yes, it
and
does.
the impotence and the hypocrisy and their blatant disobedience and their blatant, yeah, I just say their blatant hypocrisy. And so Allah allows things to happen so that many of us can see who is who. And for me, this is exposing the real nature of many of the leaders, many of the organizations, many of the personalities in this country who at this time have sided with the criminals rather than siding with the oppressed. So those are my thoughts. Those are the things that jump out at me as I watch the ongoing conflict and as I listen to those particular horrific observations made by that gentleman who made that report.
Well, my brother, it's been a real pleasure. Like I said, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to have you back in the early part of next year. We're going to continue this conversation. I'm looking forward to reading the book in its entirety myself. And, congratulations on it. May Allah ta'ala bless it to get all of the exposure that it deserves. And with that, I'm going to greet you and wish you a beautiful day, inshallah ta'ala, and till we meet again.
Alhamdulillah, brother. Thank you so much for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Now, brother Sadiq, what I'd like to do now is segue into the final piece of commentary I want to share for this year of 2023 over the Salam Media Broadcast Network on what is taking place in occupied Palestine and the global response to it. Given the fact that we had this good brother of ours, Brother SHAKIR Bakari Williams, on to talk about his book, a book that focuses on the challenges that are taking place within the African-American community, the changes that need to take place, the transformations that need to happen on our front. And they are many and they are serious. On a more positive note, I want to share some information on how we as a tribe have been responding to this crisis over in occupied Palestine. I want to share a report, but before I do, there is one other piece of video that I'd like for us to see, and then we'll come back to this. Now, the piece of video I want for us that I'd like for us to see is two young women sharing information on laws, that legislation that's in the pipeline on Capitol Hill. It's already been passed in the House. It's about to be debated in the Senate. We do expect that the Senate, given the hold, the lock that the apartheid Zionist state of Israel has on the U.S. Political system, we do expect that it's going to pass in the Senate, and no doubt it's going to be signed off on by this feckless president of ours, Biden. But it is worth receiving attention and debate within the public square. I'm reminded of something that Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, said in his the advice that he gave to the princes of his age, that there were two ways of fighting. One was with arms, and the other with law, using law as a weapon of war. And this is what we're seeing happening both here and abroad. Now, with that being said, let's see that roughly 2-minute video, Brother Sadiq.
This is really important for you to know because 6 bills have passed the House and are currently in Senate for debate this week. Let's dive into some of these bills. H.R. 798 will penalize all students on American college campuses for simply supporting Palestine. Second bill, H.R. 6126, Israel Security Supplemental Appropriation Act bill that gives Israel $14.3 billion in aid from our IRS, which is the tax dollars that we pay. H.R. 3266 is the Tolerance in Palestinian Education Act that requires revision of textbooks in Palestinian schools to portray the occupation in a positive light.
H.R. 340, the Hamas International Financing Prevention Act, which stops financial support for organizations against the occupation. The fifth bill, H.R. 3774, the Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Ship Act, which stops Iranian humanitarian aid from reaching Palestine. Lastly, H.R. 599. This bill pressures Europe to support the occupation of Palestine in simple words.
You have the power to make a difference here locally and nationally. What we're asking you to do is follow the link below, contact your representative, your senators, and urge them to vote no on these bills. To be honest with you, these bills may pass the Senate, but what civil rights organizations such as CARE are trying to do is push that needle, hold our elected officials accountable, which means that you as constituents need to call them repeatedly, leave voicemails, send emails, all of the above.
Call, send emails, like influx of messages constantly, so that they can feel that pressure from their constituents and they can collect data and know how many people are voting no against these bills.
Okay, on that note of how our functionaries, our political functionaries, our political leaders in our quote unquote democracy are using law as a weapon of war for the unthinkable. I would like to turn to a report that came out in the Associated Press. And this is one that gives me a small measure of pride. I've been quite taken in a positive way by what I've seen unfolding in the public square, both in the United States of America and other Western democracies, and indeed around the world. The people have taken to the streets on a consistent basis, demonstrating their outrage to what is being done in Gaza. There is an Associated Press report that gives me a measure of pride because it's about how Black American solidarity with Palestinians is rising and testing long-standing ties to Jewish allies. I want to share the substance of this report. It reads as follows. Sidney Wallace, a Black Jewish community activist, never felt compelled to travel to Israel, though next year in Jerusalem was a constant refrain in her Chicago synagogue. The 39-year-old said she had plenty to focus on at home, where she frequently gives talks on addressing anti-Black sentiment in the American Jewish community and dismantling white supremacy in the U.S. Quote, I know what I'm fighting for here, she said. That all changed when she visited Israel and the West Bank at the invitation of a Palestinian American community organizer from Chicago's South Side, along with 24 other Black Americans and Muslims, Jewish and Christian faith leaders. The trip, which began September 26, enhanced Wallace's understanding of the struggles of the Palestinians living in the West Bank under Israeli military occupation. But horrifyingly, it was cut short by the unprecedented October 7th attacks on Israel by Hamas militants. In Israel's ensuing bombardment of the Gaza Strip, shocking images of destruction and death seen around the world have mobilized activists in the US and elsewhere. Wallace and a growing number of Black Americans see the Palestinian struggle in the West Bank and Gaza reflected in their own fight for racial equality and civil rights. The recent rise of protests, movements against police brutality in the US, where structural racism plagues nearly every facet of life, has connected Black and Palestinian activists under a common cause. But that kinship sometimes strains the more than century-long alliance between Black and Jewish activists, from Black American groups that denounce the U.S. Backing of Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory to Black protesters demonstrating for the Palestinians' right to self-determination. Some Jewish Americans are concerned that support could escalate the threat of anti-Semitism and weaken Jewish Black ties fortified during the civil rights movement. Quote, "We are concerned as a community about what we feel is a lack of understanding of what Israel is about and how deeply October 7th has affected us," said Bob Kaplan, executive director of the Century for Shared Society at the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. Quote, "Anti-Semitism has to be seen as a reprehensible form of hate, as any form of hate is," he said. Anti-Semitism is as real to the American Jewish community and causes as much trauma and fear and upset to the American Jewish community as racism causes to the Black community, or anti-Asian feeling causes to the Asian community, or anti-Muslim feeling causes in the Muslim community, end quote. But, he added, many Jews in the US understand that Black Americans can have an affinity for the Palestinian cause that doesn't conflict with their regard for Israel. Wishful thinking. According to a poll earlier this month from the Associated Press, NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, Black adults were more likely than white and Hispanic adults to say the U.S. is too supportive of Israel, 44% compared to 30% and 28% respectively. However, Black Americans weren't any more likely than others to say the U.S. is not supportive enough of the Palestinians. Generational divides also emerged, with younger Americans more likely to say the U.S. is too supportive of Israel, according to the poll. Even within the Jewish American community, some younger and other progressive Jews tend to be more critical of some of Israel's policies. Black American support for the Palestinian cause dates back to the civil rights movement through prominent left-wing voices, including Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and Angela Davis, among others. More recent rounds of violence, including the 2021 Israel-Hamas war, and now Israel's unprecedented bombing campaign against Gaza, shown live on social media, have deepened ties between the two movements. Quote, "This is just the latest generation to pick up the mantle, the latest Black folks to organize, build, and talk about freedom and justice," end quote, said Ahmed Abu-Zeid, the director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. During a week-long truce between Israel and Hamas as part of the recent deal to free dozens of hostages seized by Hamas militants, Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and detainees. Many were teenagers who had recently been picked up in the West Bank for minor offenses like stone throwing and had not been charged. Some Black Americans who watched the Palestinian prisoner release and learned about Israel's administrative detention policy, where detainees are held without trial, drew comparisons to the U.S. prison system. While more than 2/3 of jail detainees in the U.S. have not been convicted of a crime, Black people are jailed at more than 4 times the rate of white people, often for low-level offenses, according to studies of the American judicial system. Quote, "Americans like to talk about being innocent until proven guilty, but Black folks are predominantly and disproportionately detained in the United States, regardless of whether anything has been proven." And that's very similar to Israelis' administrative detention, said Julian Rose, an organizer with a Black-run bail fund in Atlanta. Rami Nashashibi, executive director of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, invited Wallace and the others to take part in the trip called Black Jerusalem, an exploration of the sacred city through an African and Black American lens. They met members of Jerusalem's small Afro-Palestinian community, Palestinians of Black African heritage, many of whom can trace their lineage in the old city back centuries. Quote, "Our Black brothers and sisters in the U.S. suffered from slavery, and now they suffer from racism," said Musa Kus, executive director of the African Community Society Jerusalem, whose father immigrated to Jerusalem from Chad in 1941 and whose mother is Palestinian. "We suffer the Israeli occupation and racist policies. The Americans and the Israelis are conducting the same policies against us and the Black Americans. so we should support each other, Kus said. Nashashibi agreed, saying, my Palestinian identity was very much shaped and influenced by Black American history, quote unquote. He went on to say, quote, I always hoped that a trip like this would open up new pathways that would connect the dots and not just in a political and ideological way, he said, but between the liberation and struggle for humanity that are very familiar to us in the U.S. During the trip, Wallace was dismayed by her own ignorance of the reality of Palestinians living under Israeli occupation. At an Israeli checkpoint outside the Western Wall, the Jewish holy site, Wallace said her group was asked who was Jewish, Muslim, or Christian. Wallace and the others showed IDs issued for the trip. But when an Israeli officer saw her Star of David necklace, she was waved through, while Palestinians and Muslims in the group were subjected to intense scrutiny and bag checks. Quote, being there made me wonder if this is what it was like to live in the Jim Crow era in America, Wallace said. Camila Osiquera, who grew up in an African-American Muslim community in Brooklyn, New York, also said the trip opened her eyes. At the entrance to the Aida refugee camp near Bethlehem in the West Bank, Osiquera noticed a massive key Palestinian symbol of the homes lost in the 1948 creation of Israel, referred to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Many kept keys to the homes they fled or were forced out of, a symbol signifying the Palestinian right to return, which Israel has denied. Osiquera said the key recalled her visit to the Door of No Return memorial in Senegal, dedicated to the enslaved Africans forced onto slave ships and brought to the Americas. As a descendant of enslaved Africans, it brought thoughts of, quote, what the dream of my return would have meant for my ancestors, end quote. Returning to home, she said, is a longing that is transmitted through generations. Israel's law of return grants all Jews the right to settle permanently in Israel and acquire Israeli citizenship, a concept that drew support from many Black American civil rights leaders, including A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Dorothy Height, Shirley Chisholm, and Martin Luther King Sr., the father of the slain civil rights leader. Over the last decade, however, Black Americans and the Palestinians have also found growing solidarity. In 2020, the murder of George Floyd by a white police officer resonated in the West Bank, where Palestinians drew comparisons to their own experience of brutality under occupation, and a massive mural of Floyd appeared on Israel's hulking separation barrier. In 2014, protests in Ferguson, Missouri, erupted after the police killing of Michael Brown, a Black teenager, which gave rise to the nascent Black Lives Matter movement, while Police officers in Ferguson fired tear gas at protesters. Palestinians in the occupied West Bank tweeted advice on how to manage the effects of the irritants. In 2016, when BLM, Black Lives Matter activists formed the coalition known as the Movement for Black Lives, they included support for Palestinians in a platform called the Vision for Black Lives. A handful of Jewish groups, which had largely been supportive of the BLM movement, denounced the Black activists' characterization of Israel as a purportedly apartheid state that engages in discrimination against the Palestinian people. Quote, there tends to be the doubt or astonishment that Black people care about other oppressed people around the world, end quote, said Phil Agnew, co-director of the national advocacy group Black Men Build, who has taken 4 trips to the West Bank since 2014. It would be a mistake, Agnew said, to ignore significant numbers of Black and Jewish Americans who are united in their support for the Palestinians. None of the members of the Black Jerusalem trip anticipated it would come to a tragic end with the October 7th Hamas attacks, in which some 1,200 people were killed in Israel and about 240 taken hostage. No mention in this article, as in the many other reports, that the majority of these Israelis who were killed by their own fellow Israelis. But getting back to this piece here. Since then, more than 18,700 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's blistering air and ground campaign in Gaza. Now, in its 3rd month, violence in the West Bank has also surged. Back home in Chicago, Wallace has navigated speaking about her support for Palestinians while maintaining her Jewish identity and standing against anti-Semitism. She says she doesn't see those things as mutually exclusive. Quote, I'm trying not to do anything that alienates anyone, she said, but I can't just not do the right thing because I'm scared, end quote. That's the end of this article, and it's a good note to end this final broadcast on: the struggle for justice, the struggle for truth, the struggle for a self-determination for the Palestinian people is one that will continue. The struggle for the self-determination of all oppressed people throughout the world must continue. And inshallah ta'ala, we will see you again with God's help in the new year. I want to wish everyone those who celebrate these holidays, I wish you a joyful and a peaceful and safe celebration. And again, we'll see you in the new year. We'll close out as we normally do with Asr. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal Asr. Innal insana lafi kusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihat. Wa tawasaw bil haqq wa tawasaw bis sabr. Which means, in the translation of the meaning, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, by the token of time, through the ages, surely humanity is in loss, except those who believe and do good and exhort one another to truth and exhort one another to patiently persevere. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.